Hello, and welcome to the Argonaut with Jason Economou. I'm your host, Jason Economou.
Zoning in the United States was very much influenced by racism.
This show is aimed at the epic undertaking of addressing the real issues that are plaguing our communities today.
There is pretty much no point in the process where anyone will be able to intervene. Like if you're just going to build a single family $2 to $3 million spec home and sell it to an off-island investor, there's no real place where somebody's going to have an opportunity to stop that.
When I say the real issues, I don't mean the inflammatory issues. I don't mean the culture war stuff. Those issues don't interest me. I'm talking about the real issues.
And zoning is the most amazing, sinister conspiracy in my book that goes completely ignored.
How are people getting housed? How are people getting fed? Do people have access to water? What are we doing with our wastewater? How are we handling feral animals? How are we handling all of the things that are actually causing our communities to suffer?
The past 60 years on Maui have consisted of Maui becoming essentially like a affluent white suburb where racial minorities can't afford to live.
I am setting out on my own quest with this show, and I am recruiting my own Argonauts, the heroes of our modern age, who are working to address these huge issues that are plaguing our communities today.
My guest today is Sterling Higa, Executive Director of Housing Hawaii's Future. Sterling, welcome to the Argonaut.
Thank you for having me, Jason. Excited to be on.
I'm very excited too. This is my first in-person interview. First, to get us started, why don't you just tell us who you are and why you care about housing? Why am I talking to you about this issue?
My name is Sterling Higa. I run a nonprofit called Housing Hawaii's Future. Our nonprofit tries to get young people active in housing advocacy by giving them an understanding of the problem, the potential solutions, and ways that they can get involved. My personal relationship with housing is my wife and I have 4 children. So we have a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 9-month-old baby girl. And when I look forward to the time when my children are adults, I worry about whether they will be able to afford to call Maui their home. And so every day for me is a process of giving it all I can to make sure that when they're adults and they're ready to start their careers and their families, that they have the opportunity to call Hawaii home, and that everyone, our age, our children, our grandchildren, can continue to do that.
I'm going to ask a bit of a personal question. With 4 kids and 2 adults, how do you guys manage to stay here?
Not saving much for retirement. It's not owning a home. My wife and I, we're both professional. She's a graphic designer. In addition to running the nonprofit, I do strategic planning consulting. And if we were pretty much in any other state, except maybe like New York City or San Francisco, we would comfortably be able to afford a home. Here on Maui, where we live, it's a little bit out of our reach. The home that we rent, we could not afford to buy. And it's a very modest 1,000 square foot, 2-bedroom, 2-bath cottage. So it's not like an extravagant home, but even that small, modest home is beyond the purchasing power of most working families. And for every professional family in Hawaii, an upper middle class family that's in that boat, there's a family that's working minimum wage or relying on government support that's struggling even more with housing. And so it's a problem that is just more severe here than most other places in the country.
You run Housing Hawaii's Future. You guys have a really great Instagram that's very educational, and your website is very educational. But instead of directing people there, can you give us a sense of the housing crisis here in Hawaii? Why is it a crisis?
Sure. So Hawaii has limited land If you think about it, we're islands in the middle of the sea. There's only so much land available. Much of that land in Hawaii is dedicated either to conservation or to agriculture. So the amount of land that we can build dense multifamily housing on is very limited. Beyond that, we're an island in the middle of an ocean, so materials are more expensive because they have to be shipped here. We're an island where labor is incredibly expensive, so labor costs are increased, and we have the most burdensome housing regulations of any state in the country. All 4 of Hawaii's counties rank in the top 10 for regulation in the country, and that burdensome regulation means that development takes longer and costs more, which ultimately results in greater costs for the end consumer. One of the big problems is our population for the state of Hawaii rose at a constant clip for the last 40 years, and we didn't build in those 40 years enough housing to keep pace with the growth of that population. So we have a shortage of housing that has compounded with every growing year up until this point. So now, even though our state's population has leveled off and some islands are even declining, because of that compounding deficit where we didn't build enough over the last 40 years, we just don't have enough housing to support all of the families that are here.
Burdensome regulation. What do you mean when you say that? Let's unpack what are the regulations that we're talking about and why and how are they burdensome?
So this is where Housing Hawaii's Future, we try to help for the average person who isn't involved in building homes. Certain words are just words. So if I say the word entitlements, it means nothing to the average person. But an entitlement is basically the ability to build something. So in the state of Hawaii, you have to be entitled with 2 levels. The state has to entitle you through the State Land Use Commission to build certain things. So if you have an urban land use designation, you can build multifamily, but if you have a conservation, obviously you can't. And if you're rural, obviously you can't. And then agricultural, there are limits on what you can build. So you need an urban designation. So you have to go through a process at the state level to entitle your land for the urban land use designation. That's step 1. Step 2 is you go to the county and you have to get zoning permission. And zoning is just a set of laws that says what you can build and where. So it says this area is for commercial properties, this area is for residential, this area might be for light industrial. And in those zones, there are certain things you can and can't build. So after that, if you want to build housing, you have to go to the county and make sure that the plot of land you have is entitled to build what you want to build. And that process can take months or even years. So already, all we've done is gotten permission on our plot of land to build something. And we've potentially spent months or years and lots of money and time and difficulty to just get to the place where we're now ready to try to design something for the site and get a contractor and hire and get materials and then actually build the thing. Now, you would think that that'd be the end of it, but Hawaii is a very litigious state where there's always the potential that a lawsuit can come in and stall your construction project. And that can end up adding, in some cases, decades, literal decades, to the development of projects. There's a big project on Oahu called Koa Ridge, which was essentially because of various lawsuits tied up for decades. And so from the initial time when the developer says we want to build homes to the time when they deliver homes, for that project was, I think, more than 20 years. Now, as you might imagine, in those 20 years, material costs increase, labor costs increase, and all the people who wanted to buy housing 20 years ago are either gone or they found something else. So that regulation essentially is just any process that adds time or uncertainty. The longer something takes, the more expensive the end product is going to be. And the less certain something is, the fewer developers will take the risk to build that, so the less building you're going to get. In Hawaii, we have a system that manages to both take a long time and be highly uncertain. And the result is we don't have enough housing production that's affordable for local people.
One of the things that I want to add into the conversation is that in Hawaii, oftentimes there is an immediate distrust of any large-scale developer, and especially if it's a large-scale developer from the mainland. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't understand that the burdens of the regulation basically disqualify any small-scale developer. Any of these mom-and-pop firms that are based on Maui or one of the other neighbor islands that would love to be involved in development just can't actually handle the carrying cost of the land, and they don't have the staff and sophistication to handle the whole regulatory process. I mean, even the most simple environmental assessment is going to take a lot more time and sophistication than a lot of smaller firms can handle.
Yeah, it is easier for a developer to buy agricultural land, convert it to urban land, and build a huge sprawling subdivision than it is for your auntie to add one accessory dwelling unit to her property. Essentially, the more regulation there is, the more you are favoring the largest, best connected, most powerful entities. The little guy, the mom and pop shop, your auntie, to navigate all of that bureaucracy and regulation is time consuming, difficult, and because people know it's difficult, most of them won't even bother to try. And as a result, we have a housing market that has become consolidated among a few large developers, whereas if you were to rewind before the excessive regulation to the 60s or the 70s, you did have a lot of smaller developers, who were just a bunch of people got together and were like, we're going to build a small apartment building, or we're going to just build this and we're going to build that. Today, it's much harder if Jason and Sterling wanted to go into business and become real estate developers for us to do it outside of a larger company.
So talking about regulation, if we got rid of some regulations, I mean, what's the stuff that's keeping things in the process for so long? You mentioned that in one instance, the Koa Ridge instance, it's 20 years before they break ground on anything, before anything even looks like a construction site. Yeah. Here on Maui, we've got some projects that are being built right now, you can pass by, and those took 5, 6, 7 years without any movement happening just in that regulatory process. What are the regulations that are really killing these projects, that are dragging them out so long?
Sure. So without getting too deep in the weeds, I'll talk about like general principles, right? So like one principle is we, and I say the plural we, have to decide how much we want lawsuits and litigation to stop housing development, and take an approach to passing laws that allows for reasonable litigation to proceed while not allowing anybody who wants to stop development to use litigation as basically a tool to stop litigation. So good faith legal action to protect the environment obviously is really important. However, not all the litigation around housing is good faith litigation. Some of it is just people who are like, we don't want this development to proceed. And if a few lawyers are able to stall something for 5 to 10 years and kill it just by filing a lawsuit and a few briefs, that's a very unbalanced system. A second thing is just thinking in terms of certainty. So the general distinction is between discretionary reviews and ministerial reviews. And again, these are the vocabulary that for me coming into this just a few years ago, you asked me the difference between them and I say, I don't know. But the basic idea is discretionary is any time an elected body like a county council is able to make an up or down decision on whether they want to build something. So on Maui, for example, a lot of projects have to go to the planning commission for a discretionary review, and then also to the county council. And if the planning commission poo-poos it or the county council poo-poos it, a project can explode. There's another approach which focuses on ministerial approvals, which is some appointed official like a planning director being able to make those calls on their own, obviously given a set of objective criteria of what the community wants to allow. In general, a ministerial system creates more housing, because what will inevitably happen in a discretionary system is there is no advocacy group for the housing that is being created, because the people who live in those homes aren't there yet. They're not organized. There is no really coordinated YIMBY, yes in my backyard movement. However, there is oftentimes a group of people in the community who don't want to see a change, who don't want to see any new housing built. They are often very active and engaged in the process of saying, no, we can't do this. So anytime you have a discretionary decision process, you're going to favor the well-entrenched, organized, not in my backyard people. Whereas if you just say, here are the criteria of the housing we want for our community, and we're going to leave it to a public servant to decide if a project meets those standards, it is more likely that that person will allow for the projects that the community wants. The discretionary process ends up being very unfair, and it ends up basically giving anti-development or anti-housing people a platform to just destroy projects that they don't like. As a consequence of that, also, a discretionary process ends up creating a lot of avenues for political corruption. Because obviously, if your ability to get your project approved depends on people on the planning commission or people on the county council, all of a sudden developers have a strong financial incentive to support certain candidates and sort of work in certain ways there. What we should, as a community, aspire to is saying, here is the kind of housing we want, here is where we want it, and so long as a project meets those standards, it's good. However, that is not the system we have right now. It's not the system we have on Maui, and as a state in general, it's not the system that we have. There is one program at the state level called 201H, which does try to provide for more ministerial review. And incidentally enough, this is the program that most of the housing development in the state is proceeding through right now. So the state of Hawaii has created a pipeline that has more ministerial review, and that is the pipeline that most developers are building housing with. Going through the normal process is difficult for a lot of developers and home builders.
I think it's fascinating what you were saying, because what it sounds like we have right now is ministerial standards. So you have the folks with knowledge and expertise setting what the development standards should be according to what they think, and then it's discretionary approvals, where it's the elected officials, it is the community members who are getting involved, testifying, or getting involved via litigation. And it sounds like what you're proposing is flipping those around a little bit. So still have the public involvement, still have the elected officials determining what the standards should be. So what kind of housing do we want? How much of it do we want? Even where we want it to a certain extent. But the actual approvals, the final say in, is this a good project? Does this fit with the community that it's supposed to be in? You're saying that shouldn't just be rubber stamped, but it should really be up to the folks with expertise and not the folks whose property values might be impacted by the construction.
Yeah, it's just like a teacher in a classroom creating standards that they're going to use to grade the students, right? Obviously, I think we would all agree there should be standards. A teacher should have standards. The question is whether the teacher should reinvent the standards for every student, right? And I think we would all agree that that would be very unfair if the teacher just decides, they meet a new student and they say, you know what, the standards for this other student, I'm just going to throw them out and we're going to create brand new standards for you because you didn't donate to my campaign and I don't like you. That's the kind of thing that ends up happening. Now, I understand the bad rap that developers get. It just seems like a dirty word. But developers typically have options. Like, a developer doesn't have to work on Maui and doesn't have to work on Hawaii. There's a lot of other places that would like to build homes, and developers can go there. But beyond that, development costs money, and the money comes from investors. And if the investors don't know if a project's going to get built because a county council of 9, 5 of those people could torpedo their project, why would an investor front that money and take the risk to develop? So we create this market in Hawaii where developers don't want to stay and investors don't want to invest, and then it's harder to build housing. Now, as a consequence of that, the only investors that do want to invest are investors that are willing to take a huge risk. And people who are willing to take a huge risk take that huge risk expecting a huge return. And in housing, the place in housing where you get the huge return is not housing for the homeless. It's not housing for low-income people. It's not even housing for middle-income, middle-class people. The place in housing where you will earn a high return for your high risk is luxury housing. So we've basically created an environment where developers and investors, the people most likely to take the risk in Hawaii are the ones building luxury housing. And that's one of those unintended consequences of the system. We say, why do we keep building luxury housing? And the answer is the investors that want to invest in affordable housing aren't here anymore. In Maui County in particular, without naming names, there is a very famous real estate developer who is born and raised on Maui, started his career on Maui, and refuses to work on Maui anymore. One of the largest real estate developers of affordable housing in the state of Hawaii. And the reason he gives is because of how difficult it is to build here. So just take that as one case study where for Maui County, one of its homegrown talents in the space of building affordable housing has said, sorry, this is not a place where I can do business. For every person like that, there are 10 other people who have also left. And what that leaves are people who are willing to do what will make them money, right? A home builder, their job is to build a home. If they can't afford to build affordable housing or workforce housing, they still need to build homes. People still need jobs. They'll build luxury housing. And that's what we get.
And the ability to get involved, to interfere in luxury housing development is so much less than your ability to interfere with public development, affordable housing development, workforce housing development. There aren't the same opportunities to intervene.
Correct. If you're a developer building a single spec home and you're planning to sell it for $2, $3, $4 million, there is pretty much no point in the process where anyone will be able to intervene. Like if you're just going to build a single family $2 to $3 million spec home and sell it to an island investor, there's no real place where somebody's going to have an opportunity to stop that. The things that can be stopped are if you're doing a 110 unit multifamily project that's affordable for police officers and nurses. That's easy to kill. So there's this perverse system where we make it really easy to kill the things we need and really difficult to kill the things we don't need. And I look at the government, taxation, the laws as a system of incentives guiding people's behavior. And our system is set up perfectly to produce the results that we're getting. There's no surprise. If you designed a system of laws the way we have in Hawaii, we should expect to get the result that we have.
And I think it's worthwhile to give a little anecdotal example. So a couple of years back, there was a project that was being proposed that would have been workforce housing, and it was in a flood area. Now, this area was zoned for housing. It had its entitlements. If somebody wanted to build market rate housing there, they could have started building market rate housing there immediately because it was actually surrounded by other market rate housing. This was an infill housing project, which is sort of one of the standards that we strive for now. Rather than suburban sprawl, we want to fill up the spaces that we've already developed with more housing. So it made a lot of sense to put workforce housing there. Now you had community groups, you had the public, you had folks who were seeking higher office, you had everybody coming out of the woodwork to say, oh, this is a great workforce housing project, we need the affordable housing, just not there. And you had the developer come forward and say, listen, we need to make a profit off of this somehow. We want to put workforce housing here, and that's what we need your approval for. But if you don't approve it, we will have no choice but to put market rate housing there. And what happened?
And it's not just an anecdote. I'll throw one right back at you. In Kailua a few years ago, there was a 76-unit affordable housing project proposed in Kailua town. Very central, accessible via public transportation. This was during COVID, so a lot of people were at home. They used their time at home to get organized, and the community said, we don't want this, it's too tall. It was 5 stories, there's going to be too much traffic, too much parking, all of these problems. And the developer inevitably didn't get the votes they needed for the discretionary approval. They needed 5 votes on the county council. And so my understanding is the developer built 8 market rate homes and sold the 8 market rate homes to recoup the money that they had invested in the project. And so instead of Kailua getting 76 affordable units, it got 8 market rate homes. And I think the 8 market rate homes were there already. They just were like refurbished. So that is more common than you would think. And the problem is these are invisible, right? We don't see the housing we don't build because it doesn't get built. We do see the housing that gets built, which for a lot of people makes them upset. But we don't ever see what could have been there. So if you drive through Kailua today and you drive past those 8 market rate homes, unless you know this history, you don't realize 76 units could be there, right? Or if you drive through this floodplain area of Maui and you see those market rate homes, you don't realize, oh, there could have been police officers or nurses living there. And that problem makes it difficult to organize. And the general idea for Housing Hawaii's future is we have to help to organize people to advocate for a future that they can't necessarily see right now. We have to have proactive planning to figure out what is the future community we want to live in and how do we shape a policy system so that it guides us there, right? Instead of the water flowing down to there not being housing or, imagine 76 homes and then we get 8 market rate homes. We have to figure out how do we go from 8 market rate homes and the water ends up at 76 affordable homes. And the system, our system of taxes, of laws, should be set up to guide us to that outcome that we want.
Now, I want to get into zoning a little bit. I know this is one of those issues that we both care about deeply, and you've been harping on it a lot lately. So, first off, explain zoning to us.
Yeah.
What is zoning?
At the basic level, zoning is a set of laws that says what you can build and where you can build it. And it's typically set at the county level, so each county has a zoning code. The zoning code is designed first to define uses, so you have, say, commercial, which is where people could have retail or restaurants and businesses. You have residential, where people can have homes, and then you have light industrial, where you could have auto shops, and then heavy industrial if we were going to have manufacturing. In Hawaii, for the most part, we don't really have much heavy industrial because we don't do a lot of industrial manufacturing. We do, however, have commercial, residential, light industrial zones and different subsets of those. Zoning in the United States was very much influenced by racism. And the basic idea was zoning was used as a tool by whites to keep black people out of their neighborhoods. So they adopted what were called exclusionary zoning policies that essentially tried to make it very difficult to build affordable housing because that would be used as a lever to keep poorer minorities out of primarily affluent white neighborhoods. Hawaii and Maui County in particular, when Maui incorporated in 1960 and adopted its zoning code, the zoning code was essentially a recipe of exclusionary zoning. So Maui's zoning code, if you were a white suburb trying to create a policy to keep poor minorities out, you would have in 1960 adopted a zoning code that looked a lot like Maui County's zoning code. Now, again, right, the system of laws and taxes ends up creating the result we get. I don't think it's a coincidence that the past 60 years on Maui have consisted of Maui becoming essentially like a affluent white suburb where racial minorities can't afford to live. That is not an accident. That's actually the express intention of the zoning code that we adopted. Typically, those zoning codes are updated every 10 years. So in Honolulu County, in Kauai County, in Hawaii County, the zoning codes have been updated multiple times since 1960, and they reflect a more progressive, less exclusionary, less racist concept of zoning. Maui County, unfortunately, hasn't had a comprehensive zoning rewrite. So we're 53, 54 years overdue for that, and that's a really important component. A few things really stand out for what kinds of changes you would make in the zoning. So one is a minimum lot size, and a minimum lot size specifies how much land you need in order to be able to build a house. Now, as you might imagine, land costs money, so the more land you require somebody to buy to build a house, the less affordable housing is. Pretty obvious. Maui County has the highest minimum lot size in the state of Hawaii at 6,000 square feet. Land in Hawaii is very expensive, and so we've essentially limited home ownership to people that can afford at least a 6,000 square foot plot of land on Maui, which that number of people here that can afford that locals grows fewer and fewer by the day as people come in and buy that land.
And I just want to throw in, I think from what I've read recently, it's actually more cost effective in many instances in Maui County to purchase the land and then build from scratch.
Yeah.
As opposed to buying a house that's already been built. That's how upside down our housing market's been. It used to be that purchasing and building a bespoke home was much more expensive than buying something that existed already.
Yeah.
And now a house that was built in the 70s is going to cost you more than a brand new home.
Right. And so in addition to the cost of the land, another thing that the zoning code did was separate uses. So if you put your time machine, get in your time machine, go way back to the 1950s, this is like the golden age of the American suburb. Everybody wants a car and wants to drive and live far away from the city. And so zoning had a separation of uses that separated commercial from residential areas. So you had your neighborhood over here where you lived, and then you would drive to a store. But you couldn't have a neighborhood store. Or you couldn't have what we have in a lot of communities, which are 2-3 story buildings where the ground floor has a commercial space, like a small mom and pop shop, and maybe even that family lives on top, or there's residential areas above that. For the most part, the zoning codes that we adopted around 1960 prohibited that, and essentially said the only way we can build is by putting a suburb over here and by putting businesses over here and light industrial over there. And if you want to get between any of these points, you're going to have to get in your car and drive. Now, given the passage of 60 years, I think many people have come to the conclusion that that was not the only way to design a community and maybe not the best way. At a basic level, we know now that the cars burn fossil fuels, which contribute to carbon emissions and climate change, and pollution, which hurts people's lungs, and that's not so great. We know that people spend now an hour, 2 hours a day in their car, which is time that they're not spending with their families or volunteering or getting civically engaged or exercising, which contributes to obesity and all sorts of health problems. And we also know that, to be honest, these kinds of communities are not the kinds of communities that people really love and cherish. They're not the kinds of communities where an old person, a kupuna, can walk to a grocery store or walk to a doctor or access the things they need without needing to get into a car. And so they end up actually being more confining than liberating. In the 1950s, when it was really exciting, to buy a car and to do that, it might have been great. But today, where families are spending 15 to 20% of their income on transportation, it is not so great. Because today, you don't have a choice, right? Back then, you could have a choice. You could live in Paia or Makawao, or you could live in Wailuku and have a walkable community. Or you could go live in Dream City and have your suburban experiment. Today, though, everything is just a suburban experiment. And you don't have a choice to live in one of these quaint, walkable towns. And if you look at Maui, the tragic thing is since 1960, Maui hasn't really built any cool, walkable, wonderful communities. But pre-1960, pre-zoning, it built a bunch of them, right? All the small towns of Maui had that character. And so zoning is a major part of the design of communities, and design of communities is really important for quality of life, but it's also important for transportation costs, it's also important for healthcare, and it's also important for housing costs. So I am often in the position of yelling about zoning, whether it's at the county council or the state legislature or in the media, and it's because it is this invisible regulation. When I was an 18-year-old graduating from high school, I didn't know what zoning was. Nobody told me what zoning was. Even out of college, nobody told me what zoning was. Yet there's this whole rule, this set of invisible rules that shape what can be built and where and determine what kind of community we have in the future. And On Maui, for example, if we're not even having the conversation about what we want zoning to be, then we're not having a public conversation about what kind of community we want to live in 30 or 40 or 50 years. And that's a conversation for us as young people that we should be starting and engaging in, because we will inherit the result. 1960 was a long time ago. The people who were there who adopted Maui County's zoning code in 1960, many of them have passed on. And so they, I don't think, anticipated that everything would stay pretty much the same for 60 years after that. Each generation has to take the responsibility to look at the laws and figure out, is this really the kind of society we want to live in? And I think there are a lot of aspects of the 1960s, zoning being just one, that most people today would look back on and say, no, that's not how I want to live. And we have the power as citizens in this democracy to change it.
I think this is fascinating. I'm going to take this conversation in a weird direction now, because I'm fascinated by conspiracy stuff.
Okay,
as you know.
Let's go.
And I'm amazed that some conspiracy theories take hold. Like right now, there's this whole Taylor Swift and is a government psyop conspiracy theory that dummies are going after.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to talk about that right now.
Well, you did, but we won't. Let's keep it moving. Taylor Swift, okay?
The reason I bring that up is because zoning, as you've pointed out, and there are some great books on this, is very much one of those conspiracies that is out in the open.
Yeah.
It is historically known that some of the impetus behind the zoning code that was established by the federal government and distributed to the counties and the states really was to negatively impact racial minorities and religious minorities, really any minority. And here in Hawaii, it was adopted with such effect that Native Hawaiians, who ostensibly were not a racial minority here in Hawaii before a certain point, are now very much a minority. I think the majority of Native Hawaiians now live elsewhere other than the Hawaiian Islands.
Yes.
And it's been so effectively put into our sense that when you and I go to these public hearings where people are opposing a housing project or a change in regulations, they argue, well, this is against the character and nature of the neighborhood. But you pointed out examples of downtown areas, historical downtown areas, which are the only areas where we have this mixed-use development, and they're the most beloved areas. People come from all over the world to visit these mixed-use neighborhoods where you have the shops and you have the homes above. And if you go around the United States, some of the most beloved downtown areas have this mixed-use character and nature that is outlawed. And we have allowed ourselves to be convinced that, oh, we can't possibly have a house next to a store. That would disrupt the character and nature that we adopted from another place that had these sinister underpinnings to it to a certain degree. And that's what I find so amazing about people today and so incredibly frustrating, that they focus on these outlandish theories that have no real backing to them, and they're ignoring the real issues, the real conspiracies that have negatively impacted us as a society on the whole for decades. And zoning is the most amazing, sinister conspiracy in my book that goes completely ignored. And maybe because it's kind of boring.
Sure.
Once you start talking about land use designations and permitted uses and special uses and permits, people's eyes glaze over. It's much more fun to talk about Taylor Swift and some football player. But this is the stuff that I think is killing us.
Yes. David Foster Wallace has that joke about the fish, right? And, you know, the two fish are swimming along and an older fish goes by him and goes, "How's the water, boys?" And the two fish sort of turn to each other as the guy passing goes, "What's water?" And they don't realize, right, that they're just swimming in it. It's the world that they live in. If you were to go back before the automobile was invented, all cities around the world were mixed use. That's just what a city is. Also, cities were walkable. And it's only really in the last 100 years or so that we completely re-engineered cities and our urban design around accommodating the automobile and accommodating cars. And of course, a great deal of that was pushed in a very conspiratorial way by automobile manufacturers. And there was also an advantage to these people that wanted to build these exclusionary communities and keep certain people out who benefited from passing certain policies. But if you're born in that and you learn from a young age that that's the only way things can be, it's easy to get stuck in these habits and these dogmas. One thing that is really liberating, and the internet is a great advantage now, is you can actually, without having to travel, go and see other cities. You can go on Google Maps and go through Seoul or London or Paris or Tokyo. You can go on YouTube and type in Tokyo night walk, and it's just like an hour-long video of somebody walking along the streets of Tokyo, and you can compare and contrast that with what we have on Maui. And there are a lot of people on Maui or in Hawaii who say, oh, we don't want to be like a big city. The question I always ask is, well, have you been to a big city? Because yeah, there are some bad things about big cities, but there are also some great things. You know, one of the great things about being in, say, Osaka in Japan or Tokyo is pretty much from any point in the city, the distance to a grocery store, a pharmacy, a place to get inexpensive food is going to be a 10-minute walk or less, probably a 5-minute walk or less. And the distance to any public transportation is going to be 5 to 10 minutes. So you don't need to own a car. Everything you need is closely accessible to you. And as a result, many more people get out and walk, experience their surroundings, experience their neighbors, and that creates a completely different culture. Ironically, if you were to rewind the clock back on Hawaii to before zoning and go back and think, okay, what was historic Paia or Makawao or Lahaina or Lanai City like? They are more like these mixed-use cities that we would travel to in other countries. Kihei, the land of strip malls, is something completely different than every other city on Earth. And it's only, I think, if you've only lived in a suburb that you would think that Kihei is the normal and rational way to develop a community. I think many people would agree that it's probably not great to create a community where everyone needs to drive, there's constant traffic, and you can't walk to anything that you need. And yet, that's what the zoning code, our current zoning code on Maui, tends to produce.
One of the most impactful things that I've ever heard you say was you were giving testimony, and I believe it was on the mixed-use development of the mall. Mm-hmm. And you brought up the fact that everybody on Maui always disparages Oahu, and they say, we don't want to become Honolulu.
Yeah.
Because Honolulu is a dense urban city. Yeah. And you said, at least on Oahu, you can have a 90-year-old pensioner who's able to survive in the place that they lived their entire life without a vehicle.
Yeah.
And that moment when you brought that up, I was like, you're absolutely right. If you were on a fixed income in Maui County, especially over the past 5 years, where housing inflation has been insane. Mm-hmm. I mean, over 100% inflation on a lot of rentals out there.
Yeah.
And even on the sales price of housing. Mm-hmm. And I think we have bought into a lie. We've bought into the lie that all of us, if we just keep the door closed for everybody else, then we'll be able to get our own luxury mansion in Haiku or some place where we don't have to deal with neighbors. But what we're forgetting is that if we don't change how we do things, we're going to end up with a vision that's way worse than an urban city center. We're going to have suburban sprawl throughout this entire island.
Well, worse than that, right? Okay, let's fast forward the clock for Maui. Maui has experienced tremendous population growth in the last 60 years. I think it tripled its population, which is huge. And there are a lot of opponents of growth on Maui, rightfully so, because of a lot of development during that period that wasn't the best. Okay, now we're at a point where Maui's population has leveled off and is probably declining, and that population is aging. So the growth is done. Like, Maui's population growth seems to have leveled off and is done. So growth is not the problem we're dealing with today. The problem we're dealing with is you can't find nurses to work at the hospital or to care for people in their homes. We can't find teachers to work in the school. The county government has 800 vacancies and can't fill them. And any small business owner can tell you that it's incredibly difficult to find workers now. Because if you're on a low wage or even a decent middle income job and you can't find a home ownership opportunity, or you're spending 20% of your income to drive 2 hours a day because you have to go from Pukalani to Kapalua because that's the only place where there's a job and that's the only place where there's a home, your quality of life, your standard of living is eventually going to compel you to say, you know what, I'm going to go somewhere else where I can afford to have a life. And that's the situation that we're in today, where if you fast forward far enough, many of the people will either be priced out, or some of the people who do have options and are privileged to have options might just choose and say, I don't want to have to struggle, right? My wife and I, we're barely saving anything for retirement. When we get our paychecks and we pay our rent and we put food on the table and we pay for all the transportation costs, that's a significant chunk of our income out the door before we get to any of the other things that would enrich our children's lives, like extracurriculars or educational opportunities. And many people will eventually vote with their feet and they'll leave. And if you think about Maui County in terms of that vote, right, like voice or vote, people are voting. People are leaving Maui County. And it's the children and the grandchildren of elected officials in some cases, or civil servants who've been there a long time, or business leaders or community leaders. And you really have to reflect and think, if my children and my grandchildren have rejected this place, maybe something needs to change. I think the number one standard we could have for if we're moving in the right direction is if our children and grandchildren wanted to stay and be a part of Maui County, because they said, this is something exciting, this is something that has opportunity and a bright future. And right now, I would say we're not moving in that direction, but we can.
Sterling, I want to wrap this up, but before we go, what do you want listeners out there to do? How do we change things for the better?
These decisions are within our control. We're used to thinking that there's some secret cabal somewhere, or the Illuminati or something that controls events. But Maui County zoning policy is determined by the voters of Maui County through their elected county council members, through their mayor. If we wanted to build mixed-use communities where there was affordable housing, we could. The key thing is we have to elect people who make that a priority, and then we have to show up. The challenge is it's hard to show up all the time if you're working 2 jobs, right? We both work a ton to provide for our families. Many people in Maui are in that boat. It's hard to show up. So what we do at Housing Hawaii's Future, and you can follow us on all the social media at Hawaii's Future, or subscribe to our newsletter at hawaiisfuture.org, is we try to provide people short, actionable information. Here's what you need to know, and here's how you can get involved. And that's one way for people to start to get involved if they want to get involved on the housing issue. But the general principle is we have to elect people who have a vision for the future, and then we have to show up and support them when there are county council meetings or planning commission meetings. And that's the slow, unsexy work of participating in a democracy. But it's the only thing that works, because we live in a democracy, we have the rule of law, and we as the people each generation can change the laws to create the kind of society that we want to live in. And if enough young people, and not just young people, but our kapuna decide they're ready for a change, then we can create that change together. But it's going to happen when young people get organized and get active, because that's the way it's always happened. The state of Hawaii was not created by retired people. The civil rights movement was not led by retirees. The environmental movement was not led by retirees. It wasn't started by retirees. It was started by young people who saw the injustice or the problems of the world, decided that they could do something better, and tried to work together to create something. And that's what we can all do in Maui County, in the state of Hawaii, in the United States, is take it upon ourselves to help create that change together.
Sterling, I am so happy that you are working on this issue, and I am very proud of the work that you're doing. I take personal pride in just being your friend, and I thank you for being on the show, and we're going to have you back.
Thank you for having me, Jason. I appreciate the time.
Excellent, and thank you all for listening. Join us next time.
I hope that you all will join me throughout this ongoing quest to identify the issues and identify the heroes who are working to address these issues. These are the Argonauts, and I'm Jason Economou, your host. So please join me on this voyage, and I really hope you enjoy this show.